The New Testament reading is from the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated by a light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you."
Good morning.
Good morning.
One of my favorite sights is when I'm driving home from Niagara Falls on Lewiston Road, where the road curves right and descends down Lewiston Hill. It can be pretty distracting sometimes because you get this broad view of the landscape. Here's a similar picture. We're not sure quite where that's taken from. We think that's probably actually taken from Queenston Hill on the other side of the border. But you get the idea. And you've seen that view probably many times coming down Lewiston Hill, looking over across Lewiston and Youngstown to the lake and beyond to the city. And it's interesting to me the way that view has changed across the lake. Now there's three separate skylines, right? There's Oakville and Mississauga and then downtown Toronto, which seems to get bigger and bigger every year. It can be cloudy on this side of the lake, but across the lake, sometimes you can actually see the sun reflecting off the windows of all the buildings. Sometimes you can see ships in the lake as they line up to enter the Welland Canal. There's always so much to see, and only a split second to see it all. It can be very distracting as a driver. In order to take it all in, you kind of have to know what you're looking at, and you need the vision to find it right away. Otherwise, you kind of head for the shoulder accidentally. Well, if we look at all of our passages this morning from the lecture, did everybody get a chance to read all those passages? We had that really long gospel reading again, right? It comes down to one common theme. It comes down to sight. Having the vision to see as God sees. Not to see what God sees, but to see as God sees. Our Old Testament passage is the story of the anointing of David as Israel's next king. Samuel looks over each of Jesse's sons, and when he sees the most handsome son, he figures that's surely the man that the Israelites will follow as their king. 1 Samuel 16:7 says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. Even the author of the story of 1 Samuel gets that confused, doesn't he? Because what does he do? He describes David's outward appearance. First impressions make up a big part of what we think of someone or what we think of something, right? It's always important to make a good first impression. But God calls into question how we size someone up. Samuel didn't have the ability to know which man would ultimately make a great king for Israel. A king is for life. And as Samuel was finding out with King Saul, the wrong person at the top can be disastrous for the nation. And so it's hard to see what God sees, both in personal terms and in matters of decision making and leadership, from the smallest decision to the biggest decision. In order for Samuel to make the right decision, he had to accept his own inability to choose the right king. And he had to completely rely on his faith in God. How about us? How do we make decisions, and how should the reality of knowing Jesus, of being in a relationship with Jesus, influence the decision-making process for us as Christians and for us as the church? Well, Paul gives us some insight in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. Our passage is actually a little snippet of a larger section on Christian living that begins in chapter 4. It's kind of a moral code that Paul lays out for us in the last part of Ephesians. When Paul talks about light and darkness in this passage, he's talking about life before and life after Christ. If you look at Ephesians 5, verse 8, "For you were once in darkness, you were once without Christ, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light." Paul is saying here, live as children of God. Be the people of Jesus. The Apostle John, if you've ever read the Gospel of John or 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, he frequently refers to Jesus as the light. In fact, in our passage from the Gospel this morning, Jesus calls himself what? The light. I am the light of the world. Paul explains in Ephesians that once we didn't know how to live, but now that Jesus has shown us through his example of his life, through his example of his teaching, and especially through the example of his sacrifice of his life for us, that's how we ought to live for each other and for him. Having the example of Jesus in front of us makes all the difference in the world. And that's what makes our gospel reading so interesting this morning, because some of the people that Jesus is trying to reach in John chapter 9 reject his example. So let's take a look at that passage this morning. You can open up your Bibles and you can look at the whole thing. I'm just going to focus on a few key verses this morning. So Jesus says in John 9, verse 5, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Now, light can represent a lot of positive things, right? It can mean new ideas. It can be symbolic of new insights into the character of God. Light can symbolize hope that pushes the darkness away. Think of all the different ways that we use light symbolically as Christians. But sometimes light can be negative, or it can expose negative things. Like when you go into that storage space in your house where you keep your Christmas decorations, you know what spot I'm talking about? You know, those things you pull them out once a year. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I worry about what I'm going to find when I turn on the light in that corner of the basement. Like, am I going to find cobwebs or dust or a mouse, or what am I going to find? I hope that the mice didn't chew through the decorations, you know. Well, when I lived in a warmer climate, sometimes turning on the lights meant scattering certain unpleasant insects. If we look at our passage from Ephesians, Paul says that turning on the light can be a little bit like that. Take a look at Ephesians 12 and 13, if you've got it marked out. I added this after I added the notes, sent the notes to Judy. But Paul says it's shameful to even mention what the disobedient do in secret. It's like the bugs in the darkness, right? But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. Everything that is illuminated becomes a light. Sometimes we turn on the lights and we don't like what we find. It's even worse when we turn on the light first thing in the morning and we don't like what we see in the mirror, right? Sometimes facing reality stings. In John, Jesus gets under the thin veneer of the religious people of his own day. And in order to expose who they are, he heals a blind man on the Sabbath, a day when observant Jews were not supposed to do any kind of work. This healing causes such a stir that at first this man's own neighbors don't recognize who he is, even though he keeps telling them, "Hey, it's me. It's the same guy you always knew. I've just been healed." Finally, in order to bring some sense into what has happened, his neighbors take him to the religious authorities, who begin to question this man about his identity and how he's received his sight back. And they're amazed by this man. And the thing they can't get over is that they're convinced that because Jesus doesn't play by their rules, that he's a sinner. So twice, trying to be helpful, the formerly blind man gives them his take on what's happened. He says first in verse 25, he says, "Whether or not he is a sinner, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." And again, starting in verse 30, the man says, Now that's remarkable, this question about whether Jesus is a sinner. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. The formerly blind man knows he's been healed, and he's baffled by the conversation these religious teachers are having. And it's just interesting, too, because when he does finally give them this answer, what do? They throw him out. They don't like him. I mean, these guys have got to be joking, right? This man's been healed. A miracle has happened right in front of them. And what are they arguing about? They're arguing about whether Jesus is a sinner. That's silly, right? The formerly blind man's statements really get to the heart of the matter. If Jesus wasn't from God, then he wouldn't be able to do what he did. Outcome matters. This man has found a new life, but the people around him would rather have him stay in the dark. The religious teachers can't see beyond their own rules to the kind of light that Jesus brings, and it exposes them, exposes him for who they are, and it exposes the falseness of their religious life. They're not interested in giving life. They're interested in power, in keeping power for themselves. And Jesus really isn't surprised at all by any of this. He says, starting in verse 39, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." It's like the story of the little red hen. Every time the little red hen asks the other barnyard animals to help her make her bread, what is their reply? "Not I, not I." That's the reply of the Pharisees and all the religious people that Jesus is trying to reach. Jesus is trying to reach everybody here, but the paradox of his ministry is the least religious, the outcasts, the sinners, the people at the margins of society are the people that Jesus has the greatest success with. While the religious people, who should have understood Jesus as the fulfillment of all that they were looking for, reject him. They misunderstand him. They don't know where he's from or what he's doing. So how can this passage help us in our own place and time? Well, I know that these passages, all of them from our readings, cause me to ask some questions. What are the things that I really care about in my faith? Do I really care about my faith, or is my faith a way of really caring about me? What do I really value? And also questions about our church and our ministry. What's our ministry and outreach as a church look like? Are rules and things more important than people? Is the way we're doing church currently keep us trapped behind the walls of our building? Do our walls keep people out? Because the biggest trouble with religion, as we can see many examples of in our modern world, is that religion can be blinding. It's often easier to point fingers than look on our own hearts. The blinding of religion is that religion without Jesus is a false and blinding light. Jesus always needs to be at the center of all that we do. The discipline of Lent is to look inward and find where we still lack the love and the light of Jesus. To turn on the light, to look in the mirror, to be honest with what we see, even if we don't like it. Because if we can acknowledge our shortcomings, Jesus can help us to get going in the right direction again. When we're honest with ourselves, honest with our church, our ministry, it brings a good result. Paul says, and this is where I'll end it this morning, when we ask for Jesus' help, it's like coming back from the dead. Ephesians 5:14, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So let Christ shine on your life this morning in the middle of Lent, so that you and I can reflect the light and the love of Christ in all that we do.